minimalists and maximalists. Those who believe almost nothing in the Bible, and then those who believe everything, every single word, every single line. And we said that the truth is somewhere usually in between. And what I want to bring to you this evening is just a few of the many archaeological finds that we found in Israel that shed some light on our understanding of the biblical text, or that point to the genuineness and the authenticity of the biblical text. And I'm going to do so in a number of slides. They're going to be up here on the wall, and it might be well where you all can see better if we can turn the lights down just a little bit so you've got a better view. Now, the lights are going to have to go down quite a little bit to bring the pictures into view. Can you all see that fairly well? Now, how many of you have been to Israel? Oh my, the bigger part of the congregation. How many of you have ever been here to the Carmel caves? The only reason why you've been there is because you went with me. How many of you have ever gone with somebody else and gone to the Carmel caves? Okay, who took you to the Carmel caves? You did. You took yourself. Okay. This happens to be the Carmel caves. Here's one, another one up here. This whole series of caves along the slope of Mount Carmel happens to be the singular, most important archaeological site in the world relative to early man. Here at the Carmel Caves, in the last 70 years of excavations and explorations, archaeologists have found the skeletons of over 200 Homo sapiens sapien that date all the way back to 250,000 years ago. Many of the skeletons found here at the Carmel Caves are from about 100,000 years ago, and they are living contemporarily at the Carmel Caves with Neanderthal. And as a result of the findings here at the Carmel Caves, anthropologists have had to completely rearrange their whole concept of the evolution of man. And what you learned in junior high school or high school a number of years ago about that man was the end product of a long line of evolutionary development from Drypithecus and Ramapithecus and Egyptopithecus zeuxis and on until finally Homo sapiens sapien, all of that has completely been restructured. And now anthropologists are saying that it looks as if Homo sapiens sapien continued in his own line of evolutionary development alongside of and contemporary with some of these early man forms who hit a dead end and died out while man continued on in his development unto the day. There's 4 caves here. One is Tabun, the other one is Jamal, and the next one is Al-Wad next. and then around to the back side is actually more of a rock shelter than it is a cave. Next. And here back in the 30s, the archaeologist who was excavating here, Miss Dorothy Garrod, was using largely Bedouin women, and she had a male assistant, and she had to send him off someplace to keep him away from the women. And so he went around to this rock shelter here called School, and just by accident he found the skeletons right here where I'm standing of about 13 Homo sapiens sapien. Next. And here you see Mr. Calvin Smith. I think many of you here have met Calvin. He was here at one of our conferences, I believe, a year ago. He is the curator of the Cowboy Museum at Hobbs, New Mexico, one of the top anthropologists, archaeologists in the country. Has been with us to Israel and Egypt on a number of occasions, and he's sitting here at School in the very place where some of the skeletons were found. Next. And here you see one of the skeletons from the Carmel caves buried in a flex position. And if you know anything about anthropology at all, you can look at the skeletal structure and see that rather than being a typical Neanderthal, that this is a very early Homo sapiens sapien, and it dates from about 90,000 years ago. Now, there is no other archaeological site in the world that compares to the Carmel caves, and it has necessitated that anthropologists completely reconstruct their whole idea on human origins. And I might say this, that once you understand the Hebrew text of Genesis chapter 1 and Genesis chapter 2, and you read it in the Hebrew, which says something quite different than it does in the English, that it fits perfectly with the best that we know from all of the various scientific disciplines, from anthropology, archaeology, paleontology, whatever kind of ology you can think of. It fits perfectly and harmonizes beautifully with what we're finding in our archaeological excavations. But we're starting out with the earliest of the significant archaeological sites in Israel, the Carmel caves, and here you see just one of the many skeletons that were found in the area. Next. Now, I mentioned to you when we started our discussion on the minimalists and the maximalists that the minimalists have a problem with almost everything in the biblical text, especially if it has anything to do with historicity. And I'm sure that if you've read anything at all recently about the kingdom of David, that you've read that there are those that do not believe that there was ever a Davidic kingdom, that there was ever a personage such as King David, that there was ever King Solomon or a Solomonic temple, but principally a King David. And here you have an interesting inscription. I happen to know personally the lady that was there where this was found, when it was found. Her name is Rachel Ben Dov. I excavated with her 2 years ago at Achziv to the north in Israel, and she told me about her experience at Tel Dan. This was found at Tel Dan, way up on the northern border in Israel, and she was there when this particular fragment of some kind of a plaque was found, and then later on pieces that fit in quite nicely with the plaque. And if you'll notice here, it's been covered with chalk so that it'll stand out. You read in ancient Hebrew, Bet David, or the house of David, which vindicated biblical historians and also vindicated the kingdom of David, that this is the first extra biblical reference that we have to a Davidic kingdom. And I've actually seen this whole inscription. I think maybe Ron has too. Ron, weren't you with us at the museum at, what museum is it? I can't think of the name of it. No, it's in Jerusalem. Yeah, it's right in Jerusalem. No, it's not the Holy Land Museum. It's on King George Street, right across from the YMCA building. What's that? Believe me, it's there. And Ron and I both have been there. We've seen the inscription, the original inscription, and it vindicates what we've been saying for many years relative to the Davidic kingdom and Solomonic kingdom. But since this was found, one of my colleagues and friends has been excavating in the city of David and has found what she has declared to be the palace of King David. Have you read that in Bar and in other magazines? And there's quite a detailed article and pictures of the palace of King David excavated by Eilat Mazar. And I excavated with Eilat. As a matter of fact, I'll have to tell you this, all of my career in archaeology have been with the Mazars. I've never excavated with anybody whose name wasn't Mazar. Back in 1968, when we first started excavating at the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, I started with Professor Benjamin Mazar, who was kind of the head of the archaeologist, the father of the archaeologist in Israel. And Professor Mazar, after I had excavated with him for several seasons, introduced me to his nephew, Amichai Mazar. And if any of you have the BAR, you read the BAR or any of these other archaeological magazines, you run across the name of Amichai Mazar, one of the department heads in the Department of Archaeology at the Hebrew University today. And a few years ago, I told Ami that I was interested in digging with him again. And he said, well, I'm not working this next season, but I'm sure that my cousin, Eilat Mazar, would like for you to work with here. So he introduced me to Eilat, and we wound up excavating at Tel Qasile. And so I've gone from Benjamin to his nephew, Amichai, to his cousin, Eilat, and all of my archaeology has been with the Mazars. And Eilat has made a significant contribution to our understanding of the biblical text in her excavating at the city of David, just to the south of the southern wall of the Temple Mount, where she has found what she believes to be the Temple of David. Next. You all remember King Uzziah? You remember Uzziah was the king who contracted leprosy. And as a result, he had to be separated apart from the other folk, and his son reigned in his stead. Well, in our excavations in Jerusalem, we found the tombstone from the grave of King Uzziah. And the inscription reads, "Here was brought the bones of Uzziah, the king of Judah. Do not open." And of course, somebody did, but you see how something just as small and just as insignificant as a small inscription can validate a whole biblical story. And here is validation of King Uzziah. Next. How many of you have been through the tunnel of Hezekiah? Quite a number of you. In 701 BC, when the Assyrians were laying siege to Jerusalem, before they were able to surround the city and to lay siege, King Uzziah built a tunnel from the spring of Gihon all of the way back over to the pool of Siloam, which was within the gates of the city. We know from this inscription how the tunnel was dug. They started with 2 series of workmen, one at each end, and they started tunneling toward one another, evidently listening to the sound of the chisel hit upon the rock. And this tunnel that you see here still exists today, water still flowing through it, and you can still walk through it today from the spring or the pool of Gihon all of the way to the pool of Siloam. It's 1,777 feet, and they dug from one end to the other, and they met in the middle with only a 3-foot overlap. And this inscription here was found on the inside of the tunnel, about 8 feet back and just right at the water level. And it tells in ancient Hebrew how the tunnel was dug. It tells how they started with the 2 groups of workmen, and they excavated towards one another, each man listening to the chisel on the other side, working to and towards one another. And this inscription, the original inscription that was taken from the pool of Siloam, Hezekiah's tunnel, and it validates the historicity of King Hezekiah, about 701 BC, number one. But secondly, it's in ancient Hebrew. And to somebody who knows Hebrew and reads Hebrew, you can read it just like you could read the Bible today. It's not the same characters for the letters of the alphabet. They had a different alphabet, but once you know the alphabet, then it reads just like Hebrew, and that takes the language back at least 700 years before the time of Jesus. And we can assume that if the language was that developed, that it had developed for at least 700 years on back, which takes us almost back to the time of the United Hebrew Monarchy and even before. Unfortunately, the inscription is not in Israel. They took it when it was found, and it is in the museum in Istanbul. But we do have a copy of it, the Siloam inscription. Next. And here is the pool of Siloam. Actually, this particular section of the pool is just in the process of being excavated. Many of you that have been to Israel in the past have maybe not seen this section of the pool of Siloam that has been excavated just within the last 3 or 4 years by Ronnie Reich. We know that the pool is much larger, probably 2 to 3 times this size, and continues on over here on this side, but it goes over onto private property that's owned by, if I'm not mistaken, the Greek Orthodox Church. And they're trying to secure permission to continue the excavation. But when it talks about the pool of Siloam, you remember there were a number of times in the biblical text when the pool of Siloam is mentioned. Can you think of one? You remember the man that was born blind, and he came to Jesus, and Jesus spit on the ground and made a little ball out of spittle and clay and rubbed on his eyes and told him to go wash in the pool of Siloam. You remember that? And did you ever wonder why Jesus was always going around spitting on folks? Remember on another occasion, a man was blind, came to him, he spit in his eyes. Did you ever wonder why? Because there was a tradition in Judaism that the spittle of the firstborn son of a father had healing virtues. So any time that Jesus spit on somebody and they were made whole, it was a testimony that he was the son of the Father, the firstborn son of the Father. So there was some spiritual reason behind Jesus doing what he did, and it was probably here to this pool that the blind man came. Next. Just another continuation of the pool of Siloam. Next. Now you remember last night, Paul talked about this ossuary, the little bone box that was found not too long ago in a fairly large family burial tomb when a bulldozer broke through and opened up the entrance to the tomb, and it had an inscription on it. And here is the ossuary and the inscription here on the end that it belonged to Caiaphas, the high priest before whom Jesus appeared. And you remember it was Caiaphas who asked him, "Tell us, are you the Christ or not?" And Jesus said to him, "You said it." Do you remember? Now, if you don't know what's going on here, you may miss the real significance of this statement, but there's a story that is told about this old rabbi, and he was well known and well loved in the whole area around, and he was on his sick bed and he was about to die. And the folks in the community were so sad. They said, "Let him who brings us word of the rabbi's death be himself put to death." And they gathered around in front of the rabbi's house and waited. And they waited and waited, and nothing happened, nobody came. And so they decided they'd pick one fellow out from among themselves, and he would go in and bring back news of the rabbi's physical condition. And they picked one poor fellow, sent him in, and remember, let him who brings us news of the rabbi's death be himself put to death. And the poor fellow goes in, and sure enough, the rabbi's dead. Now, he doesn't know what to do. He's in a quandary. Walks back out, stands on the porch, and he just stands. And he stands and he stands. And finally, the suspense is so great that they cry out as if with one voice, "Is he dead?" And the poor fellow said, "You said it." And that essentially is what's going on with Caiaphas. Are you the Christ? You said it. Next. Here you can see the inscription on the side of the ossuary. And we read in the biblical text on several occasions about Caiaphas. And now we've found not only the tomb, but the actual bone box, the ossuary, in which his bones were housed. Again, confirming, you see, the genuineness and the authenticity of the biblical record relative to Caiaphas and Jesus' appearance before Caiaphas. Next. And you remember also that Dr. Meyer mentioned another very significant inscription, the Pilate inscription. And he mentioned to you where this inscription was found. It was found in Caesarea, and it had actually been turned over and really used for the walkway going into the amphitheater at Caesarea. And just by chance, when they turned it over, they found a portion of an inscription that says that this is a monument or a memorial to Tiberius Caesar by Pontius Pilatus. And again, vindicating the whole story of Pontius Pilate and Jesus' appearance before Pontius Pilate. Now, I don't know how many of you are aware of it or not, but for years and years, scholars poo-pooed the whole account of Pontius Pilate, of Jesus' appearance before Pontius Pilate, that there wasn't any Pontius Pilate. Why? Because in the procurator list of the procurators from Judea, there's not any Pontius Pilate mentioned. Somebody else is mentioned. Pontius Pilate's not even mentioned in the procurator list. And so biblical skeptics discounted the whole story in the biblical text of Jesus' appearance before Pontius Pilate until we found this inscription. And here you see the Pilate inscription from Caesarea. Next. Also, Paul mentioned to you about another bone box that was found. And you remember he mentioned that in this bone box was found the bones of a man that had been crucified. Do you remember him telling you that last night? This bone box had an inscription on it that even told us the name of the man who was interred in the bone box. It's inscribed on the top, on the lid of the ossuary, and his name was Eleazar ben Yehochanan. Now, it's interesting that in the book of Josephus, it tells us that the beginning of the Jewish revolt that broke out in 68, that there were two principal instigators, Jewish rebels. One's name was Simon, and the other's name was Eleazar. And it says the chiefest of the two was crucified. Now, it's very probable that this is the remains of Eleazar, who was interred in the bone box here that is mentioned in the book of Josephus. Now, we can't know for sure, but it's an interesting supposition. And here is a conception of first century crucifixion of a Jewish man based upon the skeletal remains found in 1968. I happened to be in Israel working at the Western Wall when this particular find was discovered. And you notice here how the nail, and we've got the board and the nail and the bones. Here you see the original here that are in the Hebrew Museum today. You can see the ossuary, you can see the bones, the nail, everything. But one thing we can say for sure is that Jesus was not crucified in the typical way that you see Jesus hanging on the cross, on the crucifix. That the way that the nail was placed in the heel, as you see here, eliminated the possibility of him being crucified the way you see. Also, the nail was not in the hand. It went through the bone here at the wrist. Now, this is one possibility. The other possibility is that instead of being in a flex position this way, that you had one leg on this side and one leg on this side, and the nail driven in at the heel, one on each side. But nonetheless, we know from this particular find that it wasn't done in the typical way that you see on the crucifix. Next. Now, here is a reconstruction of the temple. This is the southwest corner of the temple. This is the south wall of the temple compound. These are the stairs leading up inside the temple, and this is the stoa that was built on the inside, probably to be identified with Jesus' cleansing of the temple. Here you see the double gate and the triple gate, the Huldah gates after the prophetess Huldah, whose tomb was shown right out here in front of the gate. And this area here, you see, was a whole complex of ritual immersion baths. Now, we know from Jewish sources that this staircase here was the assembly area for all Jews for the three pilgrim festivals, for Passover, Pentecost, and the Feast of Tabernacles. Next. And people came from all over to assemble here on this monumental staircase during these pilgrim feasts and festivals. Here you see the corner. Here's where the archway came across. As a matter of fact, I was in charge of the excavations in this corner right here. The reason why I show you here is because we excavated from here all the way down about 80 feet until we hit the marble street of Herod that led along the southern wall of the temple compound. Next. And right down here on the wall, here's the street. And notice with such force that the stones fell down and cracked the street. Next. And right at the southwest corner, next, we found a stone that had a very significant inscription on it in Hebrew. It says in Hebrew, Levet Hatkiah, to the place of trumpeting. Next, here's another inscription that we found at the Temple Mount. It says in Hebrew, Korban. Korban. Do you remember Jesus talks about the practice of a korban? Korban means a sacrifice. That he was talking about how they would take the offerings that should have gone to their parents or to the elderly or whatever, and they took them to the temple and they offered them to God, and they said, this is a sacrifice to God, korban. Korban is a sacrifice. And so because they had offered it to God, they couldn't fulfill their obligation or duties to their parents or to the elderly or to those in need. But next, the place of trumpeting was located here on the southwest corner of the temple compound, and it was there that the high priest would stand and blow the shofar on the Sabbath, indicating the start of the feast, indicating the end of it, and it was here that we found that very important inscription that let us know that the place of trumpeting was here, and it was also called the pinnacle of the temple, as opposed to down here on the eastern side overlooking the Kidron Valley. Next. Here you can see it all into some kind of perspective. Back over here is the southwest corner. This is the third wall coming into the temple. Here's the monumental staircase, the area of the ritual immersion baths. And here's the southeast corner of the temple that had always been thought to be the pinnacle of the temple until our excavations proved that it was over on the other end. Next. Here you see some of my students scattered up and down on the monumental staircase. And these are reconstructed stairs, but right here are the original ones. And you remember, it was on the day of Pentecost, recorded for us in Acts 2:38, when Peter gets up and preaches the first gospel sermon. And the people, after the conclusion of his message, they cry out, "What must we do?" And Peter says, "Repent and be baptized, every one of you, for the remission of your sins, and you'll receive the gift of the Holy Spirit." Next. And the question is, where did they go to be immersed? There were 3,000 of them. Next. And here, right adjacent to the monumental staircase, was a whole complex of ritual immersion baths. Not just one, not just two, not just three, but a whole complex of ritual immersion baths. This whole area is so large that all 3,000 could have been immersed according to the Jewish method of self-immersion, where nobody ever baptized anybody else. They went down into the water, they stood with their feet apart, the hands out in front of them, and they simply squatted down. Now, they would always have somebody there to ensure that they were completely underwater. They didn't go all the way under. They could give them an assist or push them down, because in order for it to be kosher, they had to be all the way under the water. Well, this whole ritual immersion bath complex right here at the Temple Mount. And here's just one of the ritual immersion baths. They would go down one side, immerse themselves, and then they would come up the other side. They go down unclean, and they come up on the other side clean. Next. Now, in 1973, I had the pleasure of excavating, actually I did for quite a number of years, at a Philistine temple. That the only one that's ever been found, the only thing like it. at a small tell outside of Tel Aviv called Tel Qasile. It was excavating with Amichai Mazar. This is Ami Mazar. And this gentleman here with his back turned to us is Mordecai Megidon, who was the head in charge of the excavations there in the whole Museum Haaretz Museum complex. And this guy standing right here in the middle, if the slide was blown up big enough that you could see, has a patch over his eye. Can anybody guess who that might be? That's Moshe Dayan, who was the commanding general of the army of Israel for a number of years. And this little skinny fella standing over here, guess who that is? That our eye. And we are standing here at the site of the altar of the Philistine temple on which the sacrifices were offered. And it was so unusual, the artifacts that we were finding, nobody had ever seen anything like them before. And Moshe Dayan was something of an amateur archaeologist. And so every day he would come out to see what we had found that day. And here he is looking at our finds for the day. And next, here is General Dayan excavating in one of the caves. And he actually presented me with some of the finds from that cave, which I have in my office. And I think Ron's also got a vessel that General Dayan actually signed, has his name on the vessel. Next. And here are some of the unusual artifacts that we found. If you'll notice, they all are cultic objects of some kind that relate to the worship of the particular god or goddess here at Tel Qasile. Next. Here is the goddess herself. Here is one of the cult vessels. Notice it has a swan's neck on the vessel, and the swan's neck represented a phallic symbol to the ancient Philistines. And notice right here a conch shell shofar, a ram's horn, except it's not a ram's horn, it's a conch shell horn that had been carefully incised and engraved. And I was right there when it was uncovered. And this young girl was uncovering the portion of the shofar. I was seated here directing her excavation. And when she got it out, nobody knew what it was except me, because there's only one other like it that had ever been excavated in all of Israel. And I'd seen it. It's from Chatzor or Hazer. And I knew what it was. It was all filled full of dirt. And so I ran down to the laboratory where we cleaned the pottery, so on, took a screwdriver, cleaned it all out, and Amichai was seated at the desk talking on the telephone to Tel Aviv, and I went up and blew the thing in his ear. And he got so excited, he started chattering like a chipmunk, and went back up to the top of the tell, to the altar, the high place, the Bama, next. And I blew that shofar just as Dayan was coming up over the hill. I tooted him up. First time the shofar had been blown in about 3,200 years. And here inside the temple, now remember, this is a Philistine temple. Do you ever read about a Philistine temple in the biblical text? Where? With whom? With Samson at Gaza. You remember they chained him to the pillars and he pushed them apart and the whole temple came falling down. Well, here is Roy standing between the two columns that supported the roof of the temple, and you can see that I can just reach out and touch both of the columns. Now, this, of course, is not the temple mentioned in reference to Samson, but it is a Philistine temple, and they tended to build things according to a certain pattern. So this may be the pattern of the Philistine temple from Gaza, but again, it gives us some validity of the biblical text. Next. And here you see me standing on the bama, blowing the shofar. This is at the time that Diane is coming up on the other side of the deal. And some 30 years later, I have another group of students. We go back, and they have this shofar in a special room that's under lock and key. And you can't see these artifacts, but because I found it, they opened this facility for us, let us in, gave me the shofar so I could blow it for the students who were with us on that trip again in 2006. So it was a little over 30 years since it was blown from one time to the other. And I think Ron's got that picture there, but you don't have this one, do you, Ron? Next. Now, last night, Paul made a statement with which I basically disagree. Not that he was wrong, but I'm not sure that his conclusions were exactly correct. This is Capernaum, the excavations at Capernaum. And this is a church that the Roman Catholics, who are in charge of the site of Capernaum, built over what was apparently an early domus ecclesia, or a meeting place for the believers, and that was identified as being the house of Peter. And so they built the church here over the top of it, the Church of St. Peter. And I've always disagreed with it for the simple reason, if you'll read in the Gospel of Mark, you'll read that Jesus had a house at Capernaum. And everybody seems to overlook that fact. So why would anybody care about worshiping in Simon Peter's home when they had the option of worshiping in Jesus? So my contention is that rather than this being the location of Simon Peter's house, that the chances are probably better than good that it was the home in which Jesus lived. And the interesting thing is that this whole area that you see here dates from the time of Jesus. Actually, for several centuries before and several centuries after. And you mentioned, Paul mentioning right over here in this area was the synagogue that was built on the foundations from the time of Jesus. And the interesting thing here is that this one archaeological site in Israel gives us an indication as to how great the Messianic movement was among the Jews in the land. People think that all of the Jews that accepted Jesus suddenly went out and started building churches, and that's not true. Nothing could be further from the truth. There's not any such thing as churches until the 4th century with Constantine. But the early Jewish believers referred to themselves as ma'aminim, or believers. And where did they worship? They worshiped in the synagogue on the Sabbath. But on the Sabbath evening, when the first star appeared in the heavens, that was the first day of the week. And they came together then to observe together the Lord's Supper. That was the reason for them coming together. So it was the same people who are worshiping in both places. The Jewish believers celebrated the Lord's Supper after the Sabbath, and during the Sabbath they observed the Sabbath feast and festivals as well. And it was probably very late in Israel, in the land of Israel, probably more than 400 years after the establishment of Jesus' movement, that they started separating themselves from the synagogue. Next. Here is the room on the inside underneath the complex, and you could very well be looking at the very abode of Jesus while he lived in Capernaum. Or if you want to take the Catholic perspective on it, the house of St. Peter. Next. What's that?
End of show. End of slides. Last slide.
Is that the end of them?
Yes, sir.
All right. Now, if that's the end of the slides, I will give you a few moments to ask any question that you might have. Anybody have a question? Yes, sir.
When you mentioned the crucifixion found with in the ossuary, the
Eliezer.
okay, found in the ossuary.
Uh-huh.
The ossuaries were a very limited time period when they used ossuaries. Does that
Yes.
fit in that time frame?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it's first century.
I'm sorry. With the ossuaries with the Jewish revolt.
Yes, it's also from that same period of time.
Okay.
Yes. Yes.
Do you have any feelings about whether it's genuine, the James ossuary?
Yes, I do have an opinion, not a popular one. I believe that the James ossuary is a fraud. I think the actual ossuary is legitimate, but the inscription on the ossuary, I think, is fraud. Any other questions? What happened to Ronnie? Okay. You should be up here. All right, well, we thank all of you for your attention and for your attendance, and I suppose we're going to take a little short break